In this video, I'm going to be talking about the beat and how understanding it can help us create rhythms and drum patterns that we find interesting in the music that we create. Most of us can probably relate to the experience of listening to music and finding ourselves kind of tapping our fingers along to the music that we're listening to, sometimes even moving our heads. When this happens, what we're sensing is the beat. And the beat is that steady, repetitive pulse that can be felt or sensed when listening to music. Again, it can be tricky because we can't see it, we can't touch it. But if you listen, you can definitely sense it or hear it. In music, the beat is actually a unit of measurement. It helps us to organize our sounds when we want to hear a sound start and when we want to hear a sound end. Without a beat to measure the sounds in our songs, the music would feel very unorganized, and we wouldn't want to listen to it probably very much. The beat helps us to lock in that steady, repetitive pulse, which our brains are then able to lock on to patterns that we hear, and our brains really like patterns. So let's listen to the introduction to Billie Jean by Michael Jackson and see if we can sense the beat. Most of you can probably hear that alternating between the kick drum and the snare drum, that boom, pop, boom, pop, boom, pop, that sets up this very strong sense of pulse, or the very strong sense of beat when it comes to Billie Jean. Even though we say that the beat is something that can be felt or sensed, when we move into a doll, we are actually able to see the beat. Because at the top of the doll, if you remember, we have the timeline. And the timeline is that visual representation of beats and bars in music. So if we understand how the beat that we can feel and sense relates to the timeline and other tools we have in the doll, then we can begin to understand how we can use that to place sounds to create the rhythms that we want to hear in our music. So now I've uploaded the audio track for Billie Jean into Soundtrap. Let's take a listen. Now, if you notice, as you're listening, again, if you sense the beat, and you remember that we have 4 beats per bar, if you watch as the timeline, or as the playhead moves across with the timeline, the music lines up with the numbers on our timeline, much like a ruler. Tap, 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 tap. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So hopefully you can see and hear how beat 1 of each bar lines up with the numbers on our timeline. Now, another tool that we have in Soundtrap is what's called the Patterns Beatmaker. So let's take a look at the Patterns Beatmaker. So in Soundtrap, we have the Patterns Beatmaker, where we have these 16 boxes in each row. And if you look closely, the boxes are organized into groups of 4. 4 boxes, 4, 4, 4. Each group of these 4 boxes represents one beat in the music. So all 4 of these boxes together is going to equal 1 bar. So let's listen to Billie Jean again and see if we can follow along in the Patterns Beat Maker. One. Hopefully, as you listen to the music, you can sense that beat moving across the boxes in the Patterns Beat Maker grid. Now, the beginning of each of these beats, or the place where we're actually tapping our toes when we listen to the music, is going to be on the first box of each group of 4. That's where each beat begins. Now, once we can begin to sense the beat and see how it aligns with the Patterns Beat Maker grid, we can then assign beat numbers so that we know which of the beats we're dealing with as we're in the measure. Each bar starts with beat 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let's take what we know about the beat and bars and look at the assignment that we have in Soundtrap this week. The assignment in general is fairly straightforward. What you're going to do is you're going to try to recreate the drum tracks that I've given for you using the Patterns Beat Maker grid. But you're going to have to listen, identify the beat, identify the different sounds, and see if you can place the sounds in the right place to recreate the beat. Now, before we get started, there's several things that I would encourage you to do before we begin. First of all, look over here to the upper right area of the screen, and you'll see this little circle that kind of looks like an upside down magnet. This is what's called Snap to Grid. First of all, I want you to turn this off. Next, if we come over to the track headers, if you come over to the track headers, we need to click on the solo button for track 2 and track 1 because these are the only 2 tracks we're going to be working with. Next, click on the cycle bar and then grab the edge of it and move this vertical line right to the end of the audio region we have for beat 2. So now would be a good time to pause the video and make sure that you turn the Snap to Grid off, solo the first 2 tracks, and then turn your cycle bar on. The next thing I would do is if you come down here to the lower right corner, you'll see the zoom controls. So I'm going to click on the plus button a couple times just so I can zoom in a little bit. Now notice when I do that in the tracks there are these vertical lines, and those vertical lines represent those 16 boxes in the Patterns Beat Maker grid. If I zoom out again, you notice that those little lines go away, and so what I see now is basically one column for each beat in each bar. And again, if I zoom in, you can see now I see there's 16 columns. Okay, the next thing, and this is pretty important, if you notice on this track it says BPM 164. So before you start, you're going to want to change the BPM for this example. So you do that down here at the bottom where it says tempo, and if you click on this number and then double click the number in the box, I'm going to type in 164 and then confirm. Now this next box is really important. When it asks you if you want to adjust the audio, you want to make sure that you select don't adjust. Don't adjust. Okay, and with that, we're ready to get started on the first example. So the first thing you want to do is just listen. So you want to think about what are the sounds that I hear. And if you listen to this one, really the only sounds you have are a kick drum and a snare drum. And then you want to locate or figure out where the beat is. And once you figure out where the beat is, you want to begin to think about how you can recreate this in Soundtrap. So I'm going to take my cursor, and in bar 1, I'm going to click, and that's going to bring up the Patterns Beat Maker. So let's listen again. And this time I want you to focus on just the kick. So that kick drum, if we listen really carefully, is happening on counts 1 and 3. So with the kick, I'm going to put a kick here on 1, and then I'm going to put a kick on 3. And then I'm going to come over to bar 2, and I'm going to do the same thing with bar 2. So I've got a kick on 1 and a kick on beat 3. Now the other side of that is the snare drum. And if you listen, the snare drum comes in between the kicks. So if my kick is on 1 and 3 and the snare is in between, then I'm going to come to my snare line and put the snare on 2 and 4. Now I'm going to go back and listen to the original. And now I'm going to come back and listen to the one that I created. Now, the sound of the drum is a little bit different, but that's okay. But the rhythms are the same. If I wanted to change that, this is maybe. And that's pretty close to the original. Okay. So now you've got the first one done. So after you finish the first one, the next thing you want to do is turn these solo buttons off, turn the solo button on for the second example, adjust the cycle bar, and adjust the tempo. So the BPM for this one is 126. So again, come down to your tempo controls, change that to 126, confirm, and again, really important, select don't adjust. So with this one, the first thing you want to do is listen. Now this one is actually kind of tricky, but if I listen to it again, focus on the snare drum. And if you listen carefully, that snare drum is happening on 2 and 4, just like the first example. So I'm going to solo this track above it, click on it, and I'm going to go to my snare drum that's on 2 and 4. And I'm going to change this. You don't have to do this, but I'm going to get it. Let me see, I'm going to go to 70s. Now, the next thing I want to do is listen to that kick drum. And it may be really hard to hear because it's kind of buried underneath the snare, but the kick drum is actually happening on every beat. And this is really common. This pattern is what's called a 4 on the floor. So I've got my snare drum on 2 and 4, my kick drum on every beat. So I'm going to listen to the original, and then I'm going to listen to what I've created. adjust my cycle bar. So I think that's pretty close. Now there's another sound we've got to listen for. So it starts off with this cymbal, this kind of sound. And I'm going to come down here, and you'll notice in the Patterns Beatmaker you have add. So I'm going to click on add, but then I'm going to hover on this new sound I've added and click on this down arrow, and I want to crash. That's going to be a crash sound, and I'm going to put that right there because that happens right at the beginning of the measure. It doesn't happen in the second bar, so I'm going to take it away. Now let me go up here and listen to it and see what that sounds like. Alright, I'm pretty pleased with that. Now, this other sound that we're listening for. If you listen really closely, there's this little sound that's coming in between the kick drums. So every time there's a kick, I hear that little in between. So if I know that's coming in between, that's going to be the hi-hat. And so I can put that after every kick. And let me listen to see what that sounds like. Okay, that works. Now, the thing about it is that's actually pretty unusual for a hi-hat to be written that way. And if you listen really carefully, I think what's happening is that hi-hat is actually happening 2 times on every beat. So it's playing with the kick drum, but then it's also playing again before the kick drum returns. Let's see what that sounds like. So now I think we're pretty close. Let me listen to the original one more time. And let me listen to my version. Yeah, I think that's pretty close. So hopefully this will give you a good idea about what you're trying to do with this assignment, and hopefully this is enough to get you started. So from here, continue to see how many more of these you can do. Again, so for the next one is going to be our trap grid. This one goes really slow, so notice the BPM. Remember, for each one, click your solo buttons, then check the BPM, go down to the bottom, confirm, don't adjust the audio. And again, for most of these, what I would recommend is pick one of the sounds that's most prominent. It might be the kick, it might be the snare, and see if you can figure out either the kick pattern or the snare pattern first. Once you have that done, it becomes a little easier to go back and try to work in some of the other sounds that you go with it also. But for each one of these, what I want you to do is try to have 3 of the sounds. You want the kick, the snare, and then probably a hi-hat cymbal to go along with it. If you get more detail with it, you can, but that's your goal. So good luck, and I hope you enjoy working on this, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with.